So let's talk about hepatitis. I mentioned hepatitis A, which passes through feces, so that could be through direct contact or like contaminated water or food, which is indirect contact. Hepatitis B is bloodborne, and so is hepatitis C, so that could be through sexual contact if there's blood, and also, and contaminated needles. There is a vaccine for hepatitis B, which you may or may not have gotten. It's a 3-part vaccine. We usually encourage healthcare workers to get that just because of the risk of, being contaminated with a dirty needle. And then hepatitis D and E we don't talk about as much. They're not as common in the United States, but they're also through contaminated water or feces. And all hepatitis means, if you know your terminology, is hep means liver, itis is inflammation, so it's an inflamed liver, and it becomes pretty serious to the point where the person can die from it. MRSA stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So Staphylococcus aureus is a bacteria. It's very common. You probably have it on your skin. It's part of almost everyone's normal flora. But sometimes it can cause infection. So if you have a cut, it could become infected with Staph aureus. So if we have somebody that comes in with an infected wound, it just doesn't seem to be getting better, we will culture it, meaning we will take a swab of it and grow it in a lab, and we will test it against different antibiotics to see if it's resistant, meaning that antibiotic won't kill it. So if it's resistant to methicillin, which is a very strong antibiotic, then it is MRSA, methicillin resistant. VRE is very common too. It is a healthcare associated infection. It is resistant. It stands for vancomycin resistant enterococcus. Enterococcus is a bacteria that spreads through feces. So that could be directly spread from the hands of a healthcare worker that is not properly washing their hands, or it can spread through contaminated surfaces like a blood pressure cuff or a thermometer or something like that. C. diff is a pretty serious infection of the colon. It is a spore, just like tuberculosis, so it's very hard to kill. We can give it super high doses of antibiotics, and it just will not penetrate through that hard layer to kill it. So when you see on Purell or Lysol, it says it kills 99.9% of germs. It does not kill C. diff. It just moves it around. But once it gets inside of your body, especially if it gets inside of a susceptible host, maybe somebody who's been on antibiotics, which has killed their normal flora, it sees that nice, clean colon, and it just starts to colonize it, and it ends up making the person very, very sick. It causes massive amounts of diarrhea to the point where it can kill the person. It can, and I've seen a lot of people die from this. So the best thing we can do to prevent C. diff is to wash our hands. That's really the only way to get C. diff off. You can't use hand sanitizer. You have to physically wash your hands. That C. diff has to get trapped inside those soap suds and flush down the sink and be gone. So somebody who has MRSA, VRE, or C. diff is going to be on contact precautions just because it is such a highly contagious disease. And then the last thing we want to talk about is HIV and AIDS. HIV stands for human immunodeficiency virus. It is a virus. It is usually spread through blood, but it can also spread sexually, and it can also spread from mother to infant. So it invades the person's white blood cells, and once the viral load becomes high enough, the person develops AIDS. We don't have a cure for this, but it is much more manageable than it used to be. You can kind of compare it to having diabetes now, because a person can take antivirals to keep that viral load down and can live a normal life. Of course, there's still a very big stigma with HIV and AIDS. So the person, will probably not want to share that information with a lot of people, and you need to be very careful with HIPAA when you're taking care of someone who has HIV or AIDS. That is not public knowledge. So the initial infection with HIV, the person could very easily miss. It's almost like coming down with the flu. They have fever, they have a sore throat, they might get a rash, but they're probably not thinking much about it other than, oh, I'm getting sick. And then it goes away. But that's the initial infection. But once that's happened, now the virus is inside of the person forever. So eventually, the later stages of when it develops into AIDS, the person's going to have weight loss, just malaise where they feel terrible all the time, and their immune system's going to start to become worse and worse. So they're going to start getting frequent infections, just things that we could easily fight off. If the person has AIDS, that's going to make them very, very sick. So they get pneumonia from things that we don't normally get pneumonia from, and sometimes that's the first sign that we see that the person has AIDS, is they're getting pneumonia that they shouldn't have gotten pneumonia from. They also start developing sores in their mouth, and they develop something called Kaposi sarcoma, which are these large wounds. Eventually, if it becomes advanced enough, the person develops a form of dementia and has memory loss and confusion. Eventually, this will lead to death, and the death is usually from an infection that they just can't fight off. So the important thing to know with HIV and AIDS is that you just need to follow standard precautions. This is a bloodborne disease, so just like with anybody, you should be wearing gloves if you're going to come into contact with body fluid. There is no need to gown up or put a mask on with somebody who has HIV or AIDS, because you're not going to get it from them by touching them. The way that you would get it is from touching their mucous membranes or their blood, which you should be wearing gloves for anyway. Truly, you should assume that everyone in the world has it, because you don't know if that person has it or not. So you don't want to make the person feel alienated or make them feel bad about themselves by gowning up like they're some horribly diseased person every time you enter the room. Just treat them like a normal person. Wear gloves if you need to. Okay? So that's really the end of our discussion on infection control. Like I said, I know the hot topic right now is COVID-19, but we're not going to get into all of that for this lecture. So you need to make sure that you do the continuing education that's been posted to the class on COVID-19, and it's a ever-changing situation. We're learning more about it every day, and it may take years for us to really truly understand it. Like with HIV and AIDS, it took several years for anyone to understand what was going on with that. So be patient and keep yourself educated, right? Make yourself a lifelong learner. I'll see you guys next time.